Well, thank you, Luis, and everyone. It's great to be back with you all. It's a real honor to be repeatedly brought back. And today, what I wanted to do, because first of all, if you look around the audience, you'll see that you're all, almost without exception, highly experienced operators in the region. So I don't think it's valuable to sort of start drilling down country by country, but rather talk about some trends and how you read risk and how you read opportunity. Because frankly, I've, in all my past of looking at the region now over 30 years, Latin America typically has been very vulnerable to global risks. And and that is still the case, but where the global risks are sort of prioritized and listed is not necessarily relevant to Latin America at this point in time. And I'm going to explain why. Very quickly, I think most of you are familiar with our firm, but we've been operating in Latin America for over 30 years, first under the banner of Info Americas, which was then sold to Kroll, where our team resided for 4 years before we went independent again under the banner AMI. One of our practices, our largest practice, which is in the payment space, has now been spun out as a separate company called PCMI, or Payments and Commerce Market Intelligence, and operates globally. But AMI continues to operate focused on Latin America. And we're in the business of informing your decision. So if you've got a big decision to make, be it to enter a market, buy a company, launch a product, change the makeup of your marketing spend, defend your market share against a disruptive competitor, and you need to put money behind that decision, you want to be well informed ahead of doing so. And that's where we come in. Okay, so let's start with the risk side of the equation. And again, I'm going to try to keep this brief because I think the conversation will be far more interesting if we're all engaged and all asking questions and adding comments. So please don't be shy about providing an alternative point of view or even arguing against some of my statements. First of all, and again, I alluded to this earlier, if you've read Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group's recent, he put out and widely circulated, you can see it on YouTube, it's about a 45-minute conversation where he lists the top 10 global risks for 2024. And here's what they are. And what I've done is I've rearranged them to sort of reflect, or I've flagged them to reflect how they actually will impact Latin America. So his number one risk, according to him, and again, this is from a corporate standpoint, and geopolitical standpoint, is the political strife in the United States, the uncertainty that generates, the threat it is to the rule of law and democracy in the United States, possibly, and the extreme positions taken by both sides of the political aisle, both of which could be labeled populist, neither of which is necessarily good for business. But from a Latin American standpoint, U.S. political strife, I would classify it as neutral. Some countries will very much prefer a Biden administration, and some countries will very much prefer a Trump administration. Some industries will do better under Trump, others will do better under Biden. Let me give an example. Trinidad and Tobago, its entire economic future is based upon its ability to continue to supply much of the Americas with natural gas, or downstream chemicals that come from that, like fertilizers, ammonia, etc. Back in the day, when the U.S. was going through the financial crises and Obama came to power, Obama faced 10.5% unemployment. And the U.S. had been fracking gas for about 5 years and had built up enviable supplies, and the US gas had become the cheapest in the world. By gas, I mean natural gas, not necessarily gasoline. And there was a lot of pressure by the natural gas and oil and gas lobby to build export terminals. The US had been a net importer of natural gas up until then. And so all of its infrastructure was built for the import of natural gas. But now they're in a position of oversupply and they wanted to export. The problem is that the approval process for building an export terminal on land that is essentially coastline or part of maritime infrastructure that leads to international trade falls under the jurisdiction of Washington, not of individual states. So if you build an export terminal in Louisiana, you need approval in Washington, not just approval in the state of Louisiana. So Obama was approached by American chemical firms like DuPont and others who said, look, we want you to keep that natural gas trapped inside the United States. Why? Because we need cheap gas to justify the construct of as many as 10 different downstream chemical plants. And we will do that. We will create thousands of jobs, and we will put those plants in swing states where the Democrats need to win those states to win the national election. Meanwhile, the gas lobby is in places like Texas and Oklahoma, North Dakota, which traditionally vote Republican. So for Obama, politically, it was a no-brainer. Trump comes along, and he is more beholden to the oil and gas lobby and opens it up. And we get the construct of a whole bunch of these plants. Now, under Obama, Trinidad didn't have to worry about U.S. competition. Under Trump, there's U.S. gas flooding the Caribbean markets, the Americas, even further afield, Europe, Asia, et cetera. And Trinidad was losing market share and had suffered a lot. Now, recently, Biden, after green lighting a oil exploration project in protected lands in Alaska and getting the environmentalist wing of the Democrats very upset at him, he has turned around and he has stopped any further approvals of export terminals for natural gas. U.S. Was the biggest winner of sanctions against Russia by Western Europe. 60% of the gas that was no longer purchased from Russia is now supplied by the U.S. But the U.S. basically won't be able to expand its exports any further as long as Biden puts a freeze on the construct of export terminals. Some of that's going to go to litigation because some of them had already been greenlit and started construction. But that's a great example of why Trinidad would really much rather see the Democrats, environmentalists thinking in Washington than Republicans. But by and large, it's a mixed bag, and there isn't a clear winner for Latin America, be it Republican or Democrat president. If you look at the conflict in Ukraine and Mideast, and I hate to think that anyone benefits from the misery of people in those two regions, but the reality is that both those regions are important suppliers of energy and hydrocarbons, and in the case of Ukraine, of grains, wheat. And when the war in Ukraine began and we saw supply shocks, lo and behold, Latin America did well. Colombia tripled its coal sales to Europe. Argentina benefited from higher wheat prices. In the case of the Mideast, there is a good chance that this conflict will expand and include direct conflict between Israel and Iran. And that would put the Persian Gulf, which is already a very important bottleneck for the shipment of hydrocarbons, at risk. And that would drive up the price of those products, which would hurt Caribbean and Central American markets that are net importers of energy, but would benefit Latin America's largest economies, which are either neutral or net exporters. And so the list goes on. Ungoverned AI is a threat worldwide to elections and the ability to make sure that the campaigning that goes on is truthful and transparent. And obviously, that is a risk all around the world, including Latin America. The no China recovery, in other words, if the demographics of China are such that they'll never get back to sort of aggressive growth, that's going to hurt Latin America for sure. But the fight for critical minerals, where Latin America is an important supplier of those, or at least sits on proven reserves, that's going to be good for Latin America. So, unlike we may have seen in the past, looking at global risk is not going to give you an accurate picture of the risk panorama in Latin America today. You really have to look internally. And there are 5 risks that I want to sort of highlight here. One is economic. So we are in an environment, particularly in Latin America, where central banks, in the 5 or 6 countries where central banks are autonomous and have significant resources, they were aggressively raising interest rates. Now, that has had a positive impact on the currencies in those countries, but for companies, Latin American companies that rely on raising debt locally, or are saddled with debt and need to pay the interest cost of that, it's been a really tough year. Now, some countries are more vulnerable than others. Brazil strikes me as a country with high debt, both at the government level, but also a lot of, Brazilian firms with significant debt are struggling right now. You have Argentina, of course, and that's almost a separate storyline, but Argentina's ability the necessity to cut very deeply to satisfy both domestic and foreign debt holders could very well derail the reforms that Milei would like to pass. Colombia is another country with relatively high debt levels. And after the massive capital flight of 2022, when Petro came in, we are seeing interest rates still not really coming down aggressively like they are in other countries. And so high interest rates, high debt, costly to Colombian business, costly to the Colombian government. One thing that everyone should be aware of is Bolivia. Bolivia has run a pegged currency for, I think, close to 20 years. And it's been able to do that because of its natural gas exports that were significant and created a big trade surplus and allowed Bolivia to sort of bulk up on its foreign reserves. And therefore, they were able to hold their peg without any fear of that changing. But when they nationalized natural gas under Evo Morales, and they failed to properly reinvest in their productive capacity, then their ability to export went down. Meanwhile, other parts of South America, particularly Argentina, have ramped up their natural gas production. And Bolivia now no longer is a net energy exporter. It still exports natural gas, but it imports a lot of gasoline, and it subsidizes that gasoline prices by roughly 70%. So Bolivia stopped, the central bank stopped reporting its reserve levels about 8 months ago. And it is believed that they're now down to 1.7 billion, which is about a month and a half of imports coverage, and close to their bare minimum mandated constitutional minimum of 1.3 billion. So there's still some tactics they can play, but the RC administration is hoping that they will not have to devalue until after the 2025 elections. But I don't think that's going to happen. I do believe that you will see a devaluation in Bolivia, and that will prove very disruptive. If any of you have business there, be aware of that. Security risk. Everyone is being shocked by the transformation of Ecuador from being one of the safest places in Latin America to where it stands today. Security is really most acutely at 2 levels. One is when you get off the beaten track. So anywhere in remote areas, be it in the mining industry or the road transportation in sort of isolated parts of the country where there's a lack of policing or at least effective policing. You will find that the physical integrity, the physical security of your people and your goods are at risk. And this is the case in many countries in Latin America today. The other is cybersecurity. Latin America is still, and many companies in Latin America remain underprotected in the cybersecurity space. So again, whatever protocols you have in place in managing your information, be aware of the vulnerabilities that are greater in the region generally by the U.S. market. The other, of course, is it's an opportunity. All right, companies in Latin America are acutely aware that they face real risks in cybersecurity, and that's an opportunity for some of you. And the last is reputation risk, which for this sector, I don't think is that big of a deal. It tends to be more of an issue for consumer brands. But the fact is that, Latin America used to be a place where when you felt pressure on your brand, when you felt pressure on your company, it was usually a matter of just flying down, sitting down with the corresponding minister and hashing out some sort of deal. Today, your brand might be under attack from individuals, influencers, groups that are acting nefariously through trolling factories and things like that. You may be attacked digitally, reputationally, from people you can't even trace back to. And this might be from, gray market competitors, organized crime that's involved indirectly as competitors in your business. Again, I don't think it's that big of a risk for this industry, but it's definitely a risk for others. So those are the sort of big 5 risks that I've identified and learned from our clients as to what they're dealing with. Let me now address the nicer side of the coin, the big 5 opportunities. And again, I chose 5 because it's an easy number, but you could look at 10 risks, you could look at 10 opportunities just as easily. So the first one, and I've presented this slide or something similar to it in previous presentations to you guys, and that is the growth of e-commerce in Latin America. Now you can see the big red lines. That's China. And the reason China's in there is to show you that China, to me, is where e-commerce can get in Latin America as a share of retail. Why do I say that? Well, if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see square feet of retail per capita. What you'll see is that in the US, there is, after decades and decades of traditional retail construction, there is massive penetration of retail per capita in the United States. Even if you live in a relatively small city, you can get almost all you need by simply driving to a store in your city. In Latin America and most of the emerging world, that's not the case. In Latin America, if you are in the 10 to 15 largest cities in Latin America, that might be the case. But if you're outside of those cities, you're not going to get certain products. You're going to have to either fly to or travel to one of those cities or fly out to a place like Miami and buy it, or you're going to have to order online. And before COVID, people did used to travel, but COVID forced them online, forced them to make those larger ticket items. Lo and behold, they arrived. Their credit card credentials were not stolen. The products were more or less in place when they reached their home. E-commerce worked for them. And now the next time they go to make a unusual purchase, in other words, not a cotidiana, not a daily purchase, they will continue using the internet. And that's why the penetration of e-commerce as a share of total retail will continue to grow and will eclipse the United States sometime around 2028 is our estimation. So we see this space overall, all digital commerce growing at close to 19% a year. Physical, or what they call retail e-commerce, the stuff where you buy a product and it gets delivered to you, growing around 13% a year this
So
year.
the eclipsing of the green bar in 2026 will be higher share than the
blue
red,
bar,
than
than
the
the blue
blue,
bar.
than the blue.
Yeah,
Okay. Oh,
the
yeah,
blue
I
is
got
USA.
you.
Yeah,
That's right. Okay, gotcha.
but I believe that one day it will reach the Chinese level.
Wow.
Chinese e-commerce is just so efficient. They have built an incredibly efficient logistics industry around it. They've built a frictionless payment and almost costless payment ecosystem around e-commerce as well.
John, if you don't mind, let me ask you a question. So when
Sure.
you talk about e-commerce, because you can be a provider of e-commerce or a consumer of e-commerce. This is what are you looking at here?
This is total spend on physical or retail e-commerce, the purchase of physical goods, as a percentage of total retail sales. So total sales of stores and malls where you're buying physical products. It does not include the purchase of digital products like Netflix or Uber.
Correct.
Or any of those products.
But what I'm saying is the consumption of Latin America might be coming from products being manufactured out of China.
Oh, sure. Yeah, this has nothing to do with the origin of the product.
Perfect. This is consumption.
Yeah.
Perfect.
This is consumption driven. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for clarifying. Yeah. The other one that I think will be of great interest to you guys is just the sheer data demand. Digital commerce is a big part of that. Digitization of so many industries is another driver. And when you combine those two, both the conversion of sort of analog processes to digital and the sheer growth of digital commerce, like I said, is growing at about 19%. You're getting those two are combining, and you're seeing data demand growing about 31%. Whether it's via mobile or whether it's by hardwire, satellite, what have you, there's tremendous growth. The problem is that the mobile industry is not that profitable in Latin America, even though it's quite consolidated. And so their ability to invest in additional capacity is not always able to keep up with demand. So whether the market will realize this growth remains to be seen, but certainly the demand is there. Okay. Another area that may not be of interest to you guys, but is an interesting side story, is the growth of electric vehicles. The big story in electric vehicles is it's China, first of all, in terms of market penetration of EVs. Number two is Western Europe. Number three is the United States. And even within the United States, big differences between, say, California and other states. And most electric vehicles you're finding, or the greatest penetration of electric vehicles in the United States and in most markets around the world, begins with commercial fleets, and then eventually becomes consumer or residential fleets. But the point is that Latin America is still at low levels of, these are percentages of new sales today. This is not a percentage of the total vehicular park, but in 2024, for instance, to read this correctly, 4% of all new car sales in Colombia will be electric vehicles. Now, again, a lot of that will be commercial vehicles, be it buses, taxis, and other things. But the growth is tremendous. And this is interesting. What's driving the growth in big part is the penetration of Chinese brands. So overall, electric vehicles and combustion engine vehicles, Chinese sales this year in Chile will be around 35% market share. China will be the largest source of vehicles of all type in Chile this year, eclipsing the Americans, eclipsing the Japanese, eclipsing the Europeans. And in EVs, it's particularly stark, the difference in pricing. So, for instance, the most commonly sold electric vehicle model in China, like the most widely sold, I believe, sells for $12,000. Tesla's cheapest EV costs $39,000. Both are somewhat subsidized by their governments. The ones in China are subsidizing more. But the point is that just as, when smartphones were just rolling out in Latin America, people thought it would take sort of 10 years to get to 50% ownership of smartphones in Latin America, and it got there in 5 years. And the reason was Chinese brands got in there at much cheaper prices. And that's happening as well in electric vehicles. And it's going to be very disruptive to the auto parts business, which has almost always been focused on US, Japanese, and European brands, and is not well positioned to service Chinese brands. And so again, this is going to be a very disrupted space. And the relationships, if any of you are servicing the automotive market, be it OEMs, auto parts suppliers, aftermarket suppliers, et cetera, you're going to see some big changes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
First of all, I have tears in my eye. First of all, I've never seen Venezuela in a chart in the last 15, 20 years. So thank you for including Venezuela there. No, but that's not the real question. Is it the Mexico Tesla plan and other EV plans in Mexico have any effect that you see here in this, especially on the Mexico adoption? It seems very close to the rest of, you know anything about that?
No. So these numbers, by the way, are published by Economist Intelligence Unit. So I can't claim responsibility for the thinking behind them. But I do know that the Tesla plant in particular is built entirely for export to the United States. It's literally, they will have their own highway from the factory and their own rail line from the factory to the border. They will have their own customs depot exclusively for them. And it's 100% for re-export. So I don't see that having any material impact on the Mexican market. And again, it's really about price points, right? It's these are vehicles that will be priced out of reach for all but, the most fee of Mexicans.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, but it's the same thing for high tech, John. I mean, most high tech companies, factories in either Guadalajara or Monterrey, and then, they all have to ship across the border for marshaling before they can sell back to a customer in Mexico. So, for instance, we have a plant in Guadalajara, and if Telmex wants to buy a huge order of equipment from me, I can't sell it FCA at the factory in Guadalajara. I have to send it across the border and then ship it. It's very restrictions that are,
Right.
Interesting. Interesting.
Okay. The other opportunity that's interesting, but also not guaranteed, is nearshoring. Now, nearshoring, I think, is incorrectly explained by people. Most people buy into this notion of friendshoring, that factories want to move to jurisdictions that have better relationships with the United States or are certainly protected by trade agreements. I would give some credence to the idea of being protected, but the idea of, making $1 billion decision based upon something as fickle as friendshoring is a mistake. The reality is that we source products, manufacturing hubs are found in the most undemocratic places all around the world. And that doesn't really matter to companies. What matters is the price and the cost structure. And the reality is that in China, starting in 2008, the population of China under 50 years of age began to decline. It's very difficult to recruit somebody over age of 50 to go work in the kind of sweatshop environment that, Guangdong or other manufacturing centers in China have. And so the average manufacturing wage in China has been growing at over 10% a year now since 2008. So 15 years, such that the variable cost of manufacturing labor in China today is roughly 3 times that of Mexico. Now, why are there still factories in China? The reason is because the original sunk cost of those building those factories and the stickiness of the relationship between nearby suppliers, be it chip manufacturers in Taiwan, auto parts makers in Thailand, other technology component suppliers in Japan and Korea, makes a Chinese assembly operation continue to be relatively competitive. But what you are no longer seeing is decisions by multinationals to build factories in China for primarily for the re-export to the United States or to Europe. Instead, they're putting those factories in places like Vietnam, Pakistan, Turkey, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and this is where, this is the great opportunity. And there's no question that there's enormous interest. And ironically, the number one source of nearshoring transactions or new investments in Mexican industrial parks is coming from Chinese companies, from Chinese assemblers who are worried that they're going, because of the rising costs in China, are going to lose access, and political tensions are going to lose access to the American market. And in fact, Trump put a 22% import tariff on a lot of Chinese products, and Biden has essentially maintained those tariffs. So there's a real economic reason to move, and Mexico is a logical place for a lot of that. Now, the problem with Mexico, the biggest problem, has been a lack of electricity generation and reliable distribution. So Mexico, manufacturers in northern Mexico pay roughly 60 to 70% more on a per gigawatt basis than their counterparts in Texas.
Wow.
So the whole point of the energy reform that was pushed so hard by the sort of industrial grupos in Mexico back in the administration of Peña Nieto was to bring down the cost of electricity so they could compete. Mexico is take auto parts. Mexico is very competitive in tier 1 auto parts, which are mostly labor intensive. But tier 2 auto parts, like building sheet metal, plastics, etc., is much more energy intensive, and Mexico is still not as competitive as parts of the US. So Mexico wanted a greater share of that industry, and just wanted to compete better, and so they needed cheap electricity and reliable electricity. Well, the energy reforms under Peña Nieto, which are baked into the Constitution, that's why were so difficult to implement, led to over $40 billion of US investment in energy generation, mostly piping in natural gas in the United States, and created all of these new electricity sources, privately funded electricity sources in Mexico that could sell into the grid at market prices, and they produced electricity cheaper and cleaner than CFE, Comisión Federal de Electricidad. And of course, when AMLO came to power, he realized this was a direct threat to one of his most important power bases, and frankly, one of his most important sources of corruption that he needed that money to build Partido Morena and win midterm elections, etc. So he basically interfered and stopped these new entities from selling electricity into the grid. Now there's a building lawsuit between the energy sector in the United States and by those who invested in Mexico. And there's a court decision by the Mexican Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago, basically saying that AMLO's rules were unconstitutional. Long and short being that I have heard plenty of anecdotes of factories that wanted to set up in Mexico. After talking to CFE, were told they'd have to wait 6 months, 12 months, 2 years to have reliable access to electricity. and subsequently moved on to other parts of the world to build their factories. So this is an issue. This is one of the things that's holding up Mexico's ability to really exploit this opportunity.
Yeah.
And lastly,
John,
just
if you don't mind
yeah,
me asking, interrupting,
Sure.
my apologies. Yeah, just a
Please.
quick question. You're not the first reliable source where I get this nearshoring opportunity, and on Mexico particularly. However, the question goes a bit beyond on whether you see this as a normal downtrend because of the cost in China is higher, or it'll be like many other economic like cycles that it will go down and it will go up. So Mexico needs to take advantage of that time frame that China is giving on the costs. So how do you see this in the long term? Is it temporary, or is more like that's going to be the case going forward?
So I think there are certain product segments where Mexico enjoys tremendous advantage. And specifically, these are labor-intensive assembly of physically heavy products, automotive, white goods, aerospace. Why? Because the logistical costs of getting that product to the United States from Mexico is much cheaper than the logistical cost of getting them from Vietnam to the US, or from Turkey to the US, or even from Central America to the US. And so as a result, I mean, Mexico has a oversized automotive sector. It's 16% of its national GDP versus 5% in the United States. We think of the United States as a sort of, automotive sector giant. Well, the automotive sector in the US is 1/3 as a percentage of the US economy than it is in Mexico. So again, it showcases Mexico's strength, which is cheap but very productive manual labor, and great logistics cost and time advantage. So high rotation goods and heavy goods that require manual labor. That's Mexico's niche, and it will continue to have an advantage there, I think, for some time. China has lost certainly some of its factories, but I think where they can implement effectively robotics, or in certain champion industries like electric vehicles, they will be able to hold their own.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you.
You bet.
Great info, by the way. Thank you.
Thanks. So here's just this is part of a presentation I put together for a leading logistics provider. They wanted to understand where is their clustering in Mexico, and the reality is there are some clusters. There's TV screens in Tijuana, aerospace in Querétaro, IT in Guadalajara, footwear in León, beverages in Monterrey. But the reality is that there's not an automotive cluster in one part of the country. What ends up happening is you get a mega assembler, like a big global company, planting down its roots. And what ends up happening is all their suppliers tend to move close to them. And so you get clustering, but it's not because of a tax advantage of one state versus other, or it's really because of that first initial investment. That's why, why there was such an internal battle to win that Tesla plant, because they know it's not just about Tesla. It's about all the suppliers that will arrive with Tesla.
Yeah.
Yeah, the tier one suppliers. Yeah. And lastly, I just want to quickly talk about the fifth opportunity we see, which is energy transition. And one of the practices that we have in the firm is energy, run by Arthur Deacon, and he's put out some amazing stuff like white papers and articles on this. But there's a move to transition, and there's a lot of things driving it. So number one is not all the countries in Latin America can rely on hydrocarbons. Certainly Central America, the Caribbean, but even Chile do not have a lot of hydrocarbons. They're going to need renewables. In the case of Chile, there's still a lot of hydropower that could be exploited, but it's becoming environmentally very difficult to do that anymore. And so there's real interest and there's real money behind transition energy. In Brazil, for instance, there are hydrocarbons, but Brazil is a net importer of energy, and Brazil has phenomenal solar power capacity, as well as wind power. And Brazil and Chile have sort of led the region in providing the legal infrastructure to inculcate investor interest in their markets with massive concessions, either given out or bid out starting with the Bolsonaro administration and continuing with the Lula administration. There are some serious obstacles in the way of truly transforming electricity. One of them is a lack of large-scale energy storage. So, the advantage of hydrocarbons is as your energy needs go up and down in a single day or up and down seasonally, you can fire up your plant, whether it's coal, gas, oil. You can fire it up and meet that peak demand, and then you can turn it off when it comes down. With solar and wind, of course, you have no control over, or it's impossible to match the natural peaks and valleys of those natural-driven energy flows and the demand for electricity. So in between, you've got to store that electricity. We're talking massive facilities, and you've got to efficiently transmit that energy from generation source to where it's consumed. And nobody in the region today has the up-to-date transmission infrastructure or or sufficient energy storage capacity to meet those needs. But there's enough money on the table. Electricity generation in Brazil by solar is now far cheaper than what can be produced through hydrocarbons without any subsidization by the government. And so there's an economic incentive to build those storage facilities. There's an economic incentive of Brazil's privately held electricity distribution companies to invest in modernizing and building up capacity of transmission. So you're seeing tremendous spend going on. It's not a universal story. It is uneven. Mexico has gone the wrong way. Argentina, under the parent, went the wrong way. Colombia is kind of a mixed bag. So you really have to look at it country by country, but there's no question that there's fabulous growth and opportunities here when you look at the sector and you drill down by country and you drill down by where it is in the value chain of that electricity generation to consumption. So with that, again, could have chosen lots of other opportunities and risks, but those are my short list. And certainly, please welcome your thoughts, your comments, your rebuttals, your questions.
Great conversation, great points. China, Mexico, Brazil, those three comes to mind. But I'm gonna I have questions that because you did list China as a high risk for the region.
A slowdown in China.
The slowdown, right? It's very strange what's going on in China, even though it's growing at 5-6%. It's definitely not enough, and it's impacting. And there's so much banking and financing. Probably those plants that are going into Mexico are financed by some Chinese bank, and so there's a lot of investment from China. Can you talk a little bit about that risk, and how it affects perhaps Mexico and Brazil?
The slowdown or China?
Yeah, the slowdown of China.
Yeah, so certainly the deindustrialization of the manufacturing sector in Mexico, in China. In other words, the movement or the closure of a lot of assembly plants, the migration of those assembly plants elsewhere, is going to lower demand for certain inputs, be it steel inputs, chemical inputs, and other products that might be supplied by Latin America. To be honest, Latin America is not that important a value supplier to assembly operations in China that are losing competitiveness. Latin America tends to be a bulk commodity supplier to, number one, infrastructure construction in China, and number two, consumer spend in China. So, food products and things like that. The basic food products or basic consumption in Latin America or in China, be it of proteins or of vegetables or fruit, that's not slowing down, obviously. There's still all those mouths to feed. The infrastructure spend has slowed in China. They kind of overbuilt their infrastructure before or around the time of the financial crisis. They ramped that up and they took debt levels to unsustainable levels. And one of the reasons that China devised the Belt and Road was to keep those Chinese construction engineering firms employed. If they couldn't be employed to continue building out Chinese cities, whether it was their metro systems or roads or public housing, which had been built to beyond their needs, then they used them to build infrastructure in. It started obviously in neighboring countries in Southeast Asia and in Central Asia, but is now a global program and includes Latin America. But it's really, much like the United States, China's foreign commercial and even foreign policy is really driven by domestic needs. When China invests in Latin America, it follows a pattern. The first level, there's two concerns. If you're a big country like Brazil or Chile or Argentina or Peru, they are interested in securing cheap, reliable, long-term supply of basic inputs. China requires a lot of imported commodities to keep its machine going. If it doesn't have access to those, if they're not cheap, then it's going to end up closing factories. And if they're closing factories, then people are out of work. And if you're Chinese and you're out of work, then that contract you have with the government of I will put up with a lack of private individual rights as long as you provide a stable economic environment for me and my children to continue prospering, I'm okay. You take that away, I'm not okay. And so the Chinese leaders understand that contract. And so they'll do whatever it takes to keep people employed, whether it's, spending money to or buying dollars to keep their currency cheap, or buying. In the past, Japan and Korea went through the same. They bought into long-term service contracts with oil companies in places like Sudan and Algeria and Iraq. Well, now resource prices are higher, so the Chinese, instead of locking into 30-year contracts, they're just buying a company. So they vertically integrated by buying their supplier base. And that's their interest in Latin America, number one. If they're a small country like Central America, Caribbean, it's about getting votes, recognizing the PRC as the only China and essentially disassociating themselves from Taiwan, which is another agenda item they have. And then after that, the next big engagement with Latin America is selling Chinese branded products. China is no longer a maquila. China has 50 car companies and a couple hundred car brands, and they sell those around the world. They cannot effectively sell them in more mature markets because of all kinds of sort of non-tariff barriers, but they can sell them to middle-income markets, and Latin America is one of those great markets. The third is, Chinese investment in infrastructure. So you begin by buying oil companies, or you begin by buying farms, or you begin by buying mining companies. But then you realize that, gosh, the rail line to take my copper ore from the interior of Peru to the coast is terrible, and I can't. It's costing me too much to get that ore to China. So they buy the railway, or they build the railway in Peru to keep that copper low cost all the way to China. And then the fourth is services. So you find Chinese companies now in, investing in service companies in Latin America. In part, one of them is tourism, right? One of the biggest change in global tourism is outbound Chinese tourism. It is changing the global landscape of tourism. And Chinese tourists are like no different than anyone else. They begin with their national bucket list, and they go to Xi'an, and they go to Beijing, and they go to Shanghai, and they go to all of these, common destinations in China. And then when they're tired with that, they go to Thailand, and then they go to Japan, and then they go to Korea, and then they go further afield. They go to Europe, and then they go to the United States, and eventually they get interested in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's just a matter of time. But if you've ever been to China, they have a particular way they like to eat. They don't particularly like Western cuisine. And so they want, when they arrive, or if they go on a cruise in the Caribbean, they want a top Chinese chef, preparing their food. And they might as well own the whole operation and make it as Chinese as possible. So that's kind of what's driving. It's a step-by-step process, and it's all driven by the mindset and the needs of the domestic Chinese market.
That last point, they're going to have to be going to Peru alive for their Chinese Peruvian. Marta has a question.
John, thanks for those insights. What about El Salvador, right? The phenomenon, can we get more of that in other countries?
Yes, I think so. I mean, what does he call himself? The sexiest dictator in the world. I always explain this to people, to my liberal friends in the United States and Europe. I always say, look, it's easy for you to judge, Bukele or any other sort of quasi dictator, but there's a thing called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the fact is that if you're in San Salvador, and I was there 3 months ago, and you run a little corner store, 2 years ago, a guy would walk into your store covered in tattoos, pull out a gun, and say, look, we've been watching your store. We know you do $1,500 a week in sales. We think you're keeping around 20% of that. That's $300 a week. We want $100 of that. You can afford it. And if you want to keep your store going, you don't want to burn to the ground. If you want to keep your family safe, you're going to pay us $100 a week. And so lo and behold, when a guy comes along who promises to change that, and does, albeit by brutal techniques that have put thousands of people in jail who are innocent, nonetheless maintains 90% approval rating by Salvadorians, because you can't think about environment, you can't think about human rights, you can't think about gender rights if you can't even get from work to home safely, if your children can't get to school safely. Safety is the baseline of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as is putting food on the table. And the more aspirational things will come. The Chileans, the Uruguayans, they care about the environment. They care about the status of their public education systems, because the basic things are taken care of. And so there are plenty of countries in Latin America that are in a similar state as El Salvador was. Honduras, Guatemala, Jamaica. These are all countries where a strong man could easily win the day electorally and rule by decree.
Yeah, it's interesting what's happening. We'll see El Salvador, investment wise, properties and things like that. Now they feel safe in El Salvador.
The Salvadorians feel safe. I don't know about foreign companies. The problem is, though, with dictators is that they're great in the short term, right? They make the place safer, money flows again. But then the dictator, he or she is happy getting the ego boost of high approval ratings. But then eventually they're like, well, if everyone else is doing well economically thanks to me, maybe I should do well economically. And they start to take over or nationalize companies. They start to shake down companies for money. This is what happened with Ortega in Nicaragua. At first, there was a very cozy relationship between Ortega and big business in Nicaragua. But eventually he got greedy and he wanted some of that money for himself. And now he's made big enemies, powerful enemies of the corporate sector in Nicaragua.
It reminds me of Fujimori in the 90s. I mean, he was not necessarily the same, but he's the one that brought Peru from the brink of civil war. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
And he pushed through a lot of reforms that made Peru the best place to do business in Latin America in terms of low regulation, getting things done quickly. No question. Yeah. And Peru has, lost its way since, to be honest with you. And then from the mining perspective, he went from 200 permits down to 20. Now it's back up to 200 permits to get a mine started in Peru. So it's become a very cumbersome place to do business now, not to mention the security issues.
Yeah, generation. I think, Luis, you have a question? Mr.
Yeah. Hey, John, awesome analysis. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
I have a question about Argentina. So looks like, there's a deadlock here, right? We have a President Milei who wants to do profound changes. We have a Congress that they don't want to do any changes. So they're deadlocked. Inflation is running at 20% a month. So what's the outlook? If the deadlock most likely will continue, how is this going to be under?
Yeah, so a bit of a miscalculation when he put together he put together an omnibus bill that included over 600 clauses. The idea being, get it approved. People will sort of pinch their nose at some of them, but know that the bulk of it are good for the country and they'll do it. Mm-hmm. And he had support. He had sufficient support at first. And he did get initial passage, but it required a higher level passage, and that's where it fell down. And there were some procedural errors, kind of rookie mistakes that forced him to go back to the drawing board. So to go through 2 sets of voting again. And I think that was really kind of a procedural error. The public union protests, although they were not that as large as people thought they might be, they were enough, and there was enough pressure by these frankly corrupt unions on certain politicians that they felt uncomfortable passing it the way it was. Now, he still can rule a certain amount, or he can still make some changes by decree. He's got about 360 lined up. But the problem with decrees is they can be reversed by any future president. And you want to legislate your changes as much as possible. He's playing hardball. Part of it is just petulance. He's kind of an inexperienced guy who he thought with the kind of electoral mandate that he had, he would have the authority and the backing of people to make these changes, and the political class in Congress would kind of feel obliged to support him. And the fact is that right now, I would say he still has the majority of Argentines in favor of these changes, but that will erode with time. The devaluation that he already exercised, the removal of subsidies, the deregulations, and the end of price controls have combined to make or to decrease the purchasing power of Argentines in less than 2 months by about 25%. So imagine waking up and 25% of your spending power is gone. So there's only so long that people can sustain that kind of pain.
Right.
I would say right now they're still supportive, but I don't know how long they'll be supportive for. So the question is, so some people thought, well, he's acting like a tyrannical child when he saw that the bill was not passed and he was away in Israel, and he decided to make his blacklist of allies and enemies and publicize it. And some people think, oh God, how immature, that kind of public arguing with your enemies is just going to make them more enemies. But I think that the tactic behind it is to kind of call those people out. He's counting on enough public support that by embarrassing these people, in his mind, embarrassing them, he will help change their minds. It's a big gamble. It's a big gamble. I don't know that it's going to work. I'm hoping that the very effective people that he did choose in his cabinet will have the negotiating chops to engage in backroom talks with those people who opposed the legislation and see what it takes. As you know, in much of Latin America, to pass any kind of big bill, and this is not that different in the United States, you have to sit down with everybody and say, hey, what do you want? And the problem with a Puritan like him, who's never played that game, is that you end up kind of repeating the bad behavior of the very class of politician that you're railing against. But that's probably what he's going to have to do. And hopefully those more experienced politicians in his cabinet will encourage him to do it and will help him do that.
Okay.
Because even 60% of Malay reforms is better than none,
Well, at 20% inflation a month, probably within a few months we'll know, right?
Yeah.
By the way.
Yeah. I mean, look, they've always had inflation. The problem is if wages aren't going up, but the costs are, then that gets very, very untenable very quickly.
Thanks. Thank you.
You bet.
Questions? Anybody? Daniela, do you have a question? Okay.
No, I'm okay.
John, what do you see about Mexico with the upcoming election? What is the highest risk? Is it still going to be the same? Because the elected or the supposedly person that's replacing AMLO is from the same party. Es un dedazo, or you see any big changes there?
So, I think everyone on this call remembers Mexico under the PRI, and I mean the old PRI before 2000. So it's the same party, but at the end of the day, Mexico has a brand of presidencialismo that's kind of unique. And the first thing, right now, AMLO, people say, oh, but he's so popular, he's going to be able to exercise influence on the next administration. Well, with the grand exception of Peña Nieto, who was a political disaster. I mean, I liked much of his policies, but politically, he was a terrible politician. He didn't, he was completely disconnected from his own people. But if you look at previous presidents, Fox, Calderon, Salinas, Zedillo, they all enjoyed 60% approval ratings in their last year in office. The pattern is you pick the next leader, they win, and they make, in the past when Mexico had a controlled currency, you devalue the currency, you blame it on the previous administration. The previous president gets on a plane, goes to Spain as either your ambassador or simply just escaping. Mexico is no longer is no longer a pegged currency, so that's not going to happen. But as acquiescent as Sheinbaum appears to be, and basically promising to continue the policies of AMLO, that will change. Believe me, by the time she'll be inaugurated and I'm just assuming she's going to win, she'll be inaugurated in early December. And by February, she will begin distancing herself dramatically from AMLO, because AMLO, although politically he's a genius, he built a national party in 6 years, a party that had limited coverage outside of the South and center. He built a party that is truly nationwide. Now, his policies have been a disaster economically, and Sheinbaum knows it, including the energy file. And she's much more of a green energy person, and she's going to disassociate herself from his policies. She's not going to allow the CFE to be protected the way it has and continue contaminating Mexico. She's going to allow for more competition in the energy. She will probably undo some of the other decrees that AMLO passed to either protect his cronies or criticize his, or go after his enemies, which was part of what drove him. Back when he lost the election against Calderon, if you recall, Mexico sat in a holding pattern for 6 months waiting for the Supreme Court to decide who had won the election. In the meantime, AMLO owned the streets. He owned popular consent. And the Calderon people knew that. And so they went to the wealthiest people in Mexico. 10 of them stepped forward with $10 million each, $100 million fund. And they funded a massive PR campaign against AMLO that slowly but surely turned popular or public opinion against AMLO and gave the Supreme Court enough time to make decisions. I don't think that Calderon won that election, but the court came down in his favor, and it's because of corporate interests. And he named those 10 people as his number one enemy. And if you can actually make a correlation between his policies and the business interests of those people, including the 3 largest miners in Mexico. And he's really gone after the mining industry. So, that's the thing about populists. They get very personal in their style of governing. And I think that she'll be a very different face. I do not see a continuation of his policies. I see a Sheinbaum sexenio. Now, what that will look like remains to be seen, but it will be quite different than that, even though they're the same party.
That sounds interesting.
I mean,
changes are good.
Salinas was different than Madrid. Zedillo was different than Salinas. They're the same party, but totally different administrations.
Interesting. Any final questions before we close this out, ladies and gents? All right, John, I think we're all like, thank you again. Very insightful as usual. My friend, thank you for coming. The recording will be available on the LinkedIn group. If you're not part of the LinkedIn group, please join. And the presentation, right? You're okay to share the presentation there, John?
Absolutely. Please do.
Okay, great. Well, listen, for those of you, we got a couple of minutes. Is anybody a new member would like to, that's here for the very first time, would you like to come in and say, and quickly introduce yourself and tell us your background and, that's just a quick intro. I see Daniela. Thank you, Daniela, for being here. I see Mariana Matos. I see Sergio Liberato. And those are the 3 names that come to mind that are brand new here. Daniela, welcome.
Yes, thank you, Luis. Well, thanks, John, for the presentation. Great insights. Well, I'm really honored to be part of the group now with Luis's invitation. I'm based in Brazil. Been working in the IT industry for 25 years. Today, I'm in a company called Salt Security. It's a company focused in API security, meaning the root of all the data, AI will use to generate information. Besides that, I'm a mom of triplets, 15-year-old triplets. So if you guys want to talk about that too, it's always fun to exchange information. So thanks everyone for the invitation again.
I think you're our first head of LatAm with triplets. Okay, so you're going to hold that title for a while, Daniela.
Thank you.
Anybody else from the new members? Mariana, I think it was a Sergio. Claudia, I didn't. How you doing, Claudia? Please introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. First of all, the presentation was amazing. Very, very important insights from LatAm. Many things that I had no idea, and I learned a lot. So thank you, John, for that.
Thank you, Claudia.
Really great presentation. Well, I'm Claudia. I've been working in the tech and entertainment industry for more than 20 years. My last job was being a CEO for LatAm North of PlayStation, and very, very happy to be here. I work for Apple, Viacom, Paramount, Sony Pictures, and Disney for more than 20 years. So very, very happy, and thank you, Luis, for inviting me.
And you don't have triplets, right? Just
No, just one, just one. Daniela, all my.
Thank you for coming, Claudia. Okay, I think if nobody else is here, I think it's 1:30. Once again, guys, thank you for being here. The recordings will be dropped shortly later this week. John, muchas gracias de nuevo, mi amigo, mi estimado, and we'll see you in Q2.
Gracias.
All right, thanks, gracias.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone.